Hello, everyone, to the keynote talk by Priyanka Jha. And I'm delighted that she's here today. Priyanka Jha has been a member of New Voices from the very beginning. She's now also in the IAPH committee, and that's where we talked a little bit in the summer. And Priyanka Jha is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Banaras Hindu University in India. And at the moment, she's also the 20th Dr. D.C. Paved visiting fellow at Cambridge University at the Department of Politics and International Studies, and senior fellow at Sydney Sussex, Cambridge University. Her interest lies in the area of political theory, political thought, and gender politics and philosophy. And her most recent research interest is gendered intellectual history, whereby she's engaging with women thinkers from India and South Asia. And she's also very keen to work on the theme of post-colonialism, decolonization of ideas, and Indian political theory. And today, her talk is entitled From the Self to the Universal, Exploring Women Thinking in Modern India from the 1850s to the 1950s. And I'm delighted to have you. Priyanka, please let us hear your talk. Thank you so much.
At the onset of my presentation, I would like to extend my gratitude to the New Voices platform and Professor Ruth Hagen-Gruber for giving so many wonderful opportunities to a world of thinking which have rather not been seriously engaged with, and that has been a significant sort of erasure. Women thinking has been an erasure, a significant erasure from the larger academics, from the larger world of thinking. But within this world, a certain kind of bias that emerges in the form of due attention to the European ideas and the transatlantic ideas. And within that, a certain kind of understanding that has been displacing a lot of other voices that were emerging in the post-colonial world, the world of the colonies, the world of the post-colonial societies. And by saying that, I want to bring the larger sort of ambit. I want to widen the ambit and bring African thinking, Indian thinking, Asian thinking, and South American thinking. And at the onset of my presentation, I would just like to share my gratitude that New Voices has taken this erasure very significantly, and the attempts of bringing these voices and trying to map a certain kind of solidarity that women across the world were sharing, not just historically, but even in terms of the larger concerns that we struggle, we agitate, we write, we respond towards. So on that note, thank you for taking these voices significantly, and the New Voices. These are voices which are very, very important. So I would like to share my presentation. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. Yeah. Is it working?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yeah. So I come from a legacy of extraordinary women, the mothers who have struggled against obstacles and barriers of several kinds. They've crossed thresholds, they've withstood challenges of extraordinary kinds. And it never deterred them in carving a path that we, the women of the present century, we in India and globally enjoy, who are privileged with. These foremothers who emboldened the times, resisted the orthodoxy, who challenged patriarchies of several kinds. And in the context of the colonized world, we were dealing with patriarchies of our own native men, but also of the colonial masters, which should not, and the colonial state, which should get the attention that many of the historiographies have kind of not taken significantly. Whether it was the native men or the colonial masters, these women have been absent from the larger narratives and histories of the nation. obscured, marginalized, and invisibilized from the specters of the nation and the world, from the mainstream discourse of thinking, writing, and most importantly, being. These women thinkers have been lost. It is time that we reclaim them and we recover these voices and the ideas that they stood for. Now, before I get into my presentation and I talk about from the self to the universal, how Indian women thinking were not just engaging with concerns which were relevant to their immediate context, many of their ideas also make sense to the larger sort of agitations that women were leading worldwide. So there's a larger sort of a connection to these ideas. I just want to share some personal experiences as to why I decided to take this line of work. So as a student of political thought and political theory in India, I always used to think that, where are these women thinkers? I've grown up hearing about some of these extraordinary women who played such an important role in the national movement, in shaping of the nation, but yet they were replete in the larger sort of historiography, larger kind of social sciences and humanities. Though I was trained in some of the most radical educational institutions, and it was the will of these extraordinary teachers and pedagogues who thought that it was important to bring these women voices, these were personal sort of narratives, these were personal attempts. But if you look at the larger syllabuses, if you look at the larger text, if you look at the larger sort of world of training the young minds, whereby it's so important for us to teach, that women played equally important role in all kinds of processes, whether they were political, social, or economic or cultural. It is so important because it also, bringing Gerda Lerner's argument that it is just very, very important that we engage with these voices, because if we don't bring these voices, if we don't engage with their writings and their ideas, there's a huge kind of violence, because you're denying the future generation exemplars and role models and heroines. Why does the history always have to be his story and not her story? And I thought I would want to question this. I would want to take this as a line of work. And that kind of encouraged me to look into what I call as gendered global intellectual history of ideas, tracing women thinkers. The other thing was the absence of these women thinkers from our walls and the halls, the great halls. So wherever you go, one tends to always see that, we never find our women thinkers on the wall. Of course, there are statues and there are busts of the great women queens. But if you look at the numbers, and if you had to do some kind of mapping or some kind of audit, one would realize that, they're just not there. So most frequently in my university, where I teach, Banaras Hindu University, which is one of the oldest universities of India, it came during a very interesting time when there was agitation for national education, was co-founded by a woman thinker. Her name is Annie Besant, a very famous theosophist and somebody who played significant role in shaping women's education. So I do come from a proud lineage of working in a university which was founded by a woman. So we did an experiment. We decided that the hallways of our department, we would put equal images of women thinkers. And that was just so fascinating, because the conversation started, and the conversation from senior colleagues to my contemporaries, a lot of people had heard about these women thinkers, but had never seen them. So in a way, like, just getting them on the wall was just so exciting, because it just got a lot of attention, a lot of conversation, and the interest in knowing about who they were and what they did. And I would say that it is just not, I'm not going to say that it's only the case of Indian universities. This is a little experiment I'm trying to do here in Cambridge, because there are a lot of colleges, there are great halls, and it's just so fascinating that the story is replicating. Even in these great walls, you hardly find women thinkers, women philosophers, or for that matter, even great women fellows. And it was very interesting for me to know that it was only till late 1970s that women were actually allowed in these colleges, and women were allowed as in Cambridge University, one of the greatest universities, one of the greatest sources of knowledge. And this is not just, again, I would say this is not just Cambridge University. This whole sort of myopic and invisibilization of women has been there historically. And projects like this, which not only attempts to reclaim and sort of bring in their voices, bringing their ideas, it becomes very, very important. Okay, I need to go full screen. Sorry, yeah. Is it fine? Sorry, I didn't realize. Is my slide showing perfectly well?
It's still not in full screen, but I think if you go onto the view section, you might be able to go, if you where it says view, no, just a little bit further down. It's in the very corner where you just were, but a little bit further down.
Okay.
It says view.
I am not somebody who is very good with
Don't worry about it.
But
on the other side. Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry. So what I've been saying is that there has been a major sort of invisibilization, and women thinking tradition has been such a significant intellectual tradition. They've been lost, invisibilized, marginalized. And this I refer as something called epistemic violence. And this violence is across disciplines, whether we look at political philosophy, look at political thought, we look at political theory, or for that matter, history. And women have always been producers of knowledge. It is not just a modern century phenomena, but if you look at ancient societies, or if you look at medieval societies, women have always been producing knowledge. They've been, they have written, they have produced, and these ideas were very, very important in shaping what one can call as nascent feminism. And these were happening not so much in conversation with other, but they were happening. There was definitely a certain kind of subjectivity which was being shaped. And this subjectivity was based in a lot of experiences. So this subjectivity was coming from a lot of knowledge, which was experiential. This was coming from a lot of everyday practices. And there were not very radical theories about amelioration of women condition, but one of the recurrent ideas were like, how do we emancipate women from their drudgery or from their unequal sort of location? And it's interesting because, there's always this question about where are the canons, where are the texts that they have produced? They were producing texts. Now something which is very interesting that literary works have produced to us, that we need to really go beyond the given and understand what a text is. And the text is coming in the form of poetry, it is coming in the form of short stories, it is coming in the form of prose, it is coming in the form of speeches and pamphlets that they were sort of writing and engaging. A lot of pamphlets that were being published in vernaculars, women communicating to each other. And also I feel that another very important side of understanding their ideas, what can be considered as a text, is their life in themselves, because they were also, if you look at their life, when it comes to a lot of people like, the great exemplar like Buddha, or for that matter, Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchandra Gandhi, there's this idea that, you look at his life and his life becomes a text in itself. And I would like to use that logic and apply to a lot of women thinkers and argue that these women activists, these women leaders, these women thinkers, if you look at their lives, the kind of choices that they were making, the kind of politics that they were ensuing, becomes a text for us to also understand the larger ideas that they kind of represents. And it's time that we kind of invert what is considered as the canon, as the big sort of source, and democratize canons and move beyond the given brain and understand how words, meanings, conversations, letters, exchanges, they become canon in themselves. And very fascinatingly, the global intellectual history of ideas is attempting to do that. It is trying to invert the canon so that we move to the margins and we move beyond the core, we move beyond the center and identify what these ideas are, how these ideas are, and how ideas have been migrating and moving. So the universe of Indian women thinking have been radical, subversive, and alternative. I have three images here. We don't have Tarabai's image, but there is a sort of imaginative image that I would share. But Pandita Ramabai, so for today's lecture, I will be engaging with Pandita Ramabai, Begum Rokeya Shekhawat, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, and Tarabai Shinde. I thought that I would get four concepts out, four themes of their writings through through one of their representative sort of texts. But before coming to this universe of women thinking, I would like to bring three major sort of points. First, Indian women thinking was not homogeneous. It was diverse. When I say it was diverse, it was being written in different vernaculars. It was coming from different experiences. It was coming from different kind of exchanges. So of course, there was all these ideas that were emerging, but a lot of them had a huge focus on what these practices were emerging in their local sort of context. So they would talk about various kinds of experiences, but many of these experiences were also very immediate, were very local. So when I say that they're from the self, so a lot of these concerns were self-driven, were self-related, but also the possibility of these ideas and these concerns which were universal, which were taking different shape, because societies, this is very important, and post-colonialism has also been arguing that these post-colonial societies are also diverse. Let's not just juxtapose them into one kind of society or one kind of colonialism or one kind of experiences. These experiences were variegated. Therefore, these feminisms or these responses that were emerging were also very, very variegated. And when we talk about this diversity of thinking, it makes the corpus very, very rich. So a lot of them were writing in Kannada, like Kamla Devi in Kannada, English. Pandita Ramabai wrote in Marathi. Begum Rokeya wrote in Bengali. So you get a lot of different vernaculars and a lot of ideas. And then eventually, when you sort of translate their work and you try to understand, because they're writing in different periods of time, Pandita Ramabai is writing in 1880s, Rokeya is writing in 1890s, 1910, Kamla Devi is writing in 1930s and 20s. And you just also understand that, things are not changing. And many a times when you sort of read them in the contemporary times, many of the ideas are extremely relevant to the contemporary society also. Maybe the practices have changed, but this hallowed institution of patriarchy shapes itself with changing times, and therefore the responses are different. But if you kind of read it as if you want to trace a certain kind of genealogy, you find a lot of connection, you find a lot of semblance to what they were writing. And therefore, what we can actually have is an entire sort of treatise on women thinking emerging from 19th to 20th century. So there are connectivities, there are larger linkages in these ideas, but these ideas are also focused to a certain time, which takes me to this very interesting understanding how agency was being constructed, how women were thinking about their subjectivity, how women were thinking about emancipation, how women were talking about agency. And one particular argument that you find resonating across a lot of voices was the theme of education. Everyone were of the belief that education was so important for the amelioration and for the improvement for women's condition in modern India. And another very important thing, that most of them did not address themselves as feminists. Like they would have, like Kamla Devi writes very, very clearly that I would not want to be addressed as a feminist. And you get this. And it is emerging more in the early 20th century than 19th century. But it led me thinking that why would they want to distance themselves from the category of, why would they not call themselves feminist? Because there was a lot of connotations that were emerging with the category of feminism. So they were basically arguing that, if and also the times when they were writing to a very hostile readership. In fact, most of the social reformers of modern India who were celebrated as these hallowed social reformers who worked extensively for the women's condition in India, when it came to these women writing, or these women sort of responding, they were very, very obstructive. For example, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was considered as somebody who was championing the rights of women, when Ramabai converted to Christianity, she had the worst kind of response and the worst kind of sort of reception from the Indian social reformers, because she was considered as a lost woman, as somebody who lost her soul, who converted to an alien religion, and the kind of orthodoxy, the kind of challenges that they had to sort of face. There was a very interesting article in Manushi, one of the journals, which argued why these women did not call themselves feminists, because there was a lot of connotation of being male hating, of somebody who despised men, despising men or despising the social order or being too radical was something that would have not taken their project very forward, because they understood that it was more important for them to carry forward the progressive ideas, carry forward their work, and they had to do it in a certain kind of setup. They had to do it in a certain kind of milieu. So they had to adopt a certain kind of pragmatic way, which would help them carry forward their project. And there are large number of writings. Padma Anagol has identified several strands of feminism or gendered orientation during that particular period of time, from ecofeminism to Gandhian feminism, to what was referred to as an egalitarian feminism, socialist feminism. But one common semblance within these categories is the idea of the indigenous feminism. Now, that brings us to a very interesting sort of question, because there's been a lot of writing which says that the post-colonial feminism was being shaped by interaction with the West, was emerging with a lot of sort of understanding from our West. Is it a borrowed concept? Is Indian feminism a derivative concept? To which a lot of people would actually argue. People like Tanika Sarkar, people like Padma Anagol would argue that this needs to be read as nascent indigenous feminism, because a lot of these responses were, these women did not even know about what was written in the West. Like Mary Wollstonecraft had written in 18th century, but a lot of women who were writing in 19th century in India were not really aware of Wollstonecraft writing, which becomes more in the 20th century when a lot of these women are traveling abroad and they're interacting. Like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay's socialist feminism did emerge with a lot of conversation in America, in Europe, where she was attending all these big conferences, and also her understanding about bodily autonomy and birthright and reproductive right was emerging in interaction with Margaret Sanger. So it's interesting that you do find those networks of transactions, of ideational transaction. But I would still say that 19th century was very focused to what these concerns were immediate. So now coming to the themes of exploration, as I've mentioned that I would be engaging with the writings and work of Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, Begum Rokeya, Hussain Shekhawat, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, and Tarabai Shinde. I have identified 4 categories, 4 themes to discuss, which come in the form of religion, education, labor, and dignity. But women were writing on entire set of social issues, because a lot of, and this is where it becomes very important for us to understand that there's a very interesting debate that happened amongst the nationalist historians who were basically arguing and talking about the moment of the national movement, moment of the nationalist agitation for independence, because it was also led by a certain kind of social activism, whereby a lot of concerns related to women that emerged. And this whole thing, whether a lot of rights that women got post-independence or during the period of independence, was that the benevolence of the colonial state? Was it due to the struggle of these social reformers? And a lot of feminist historians and social historians have actually argued that it was not emerging from the benevolence of the state, because the state did not decide to engage with a lot of these social concerns, because these concerns were considered as part of the inner domain. Partha Chatterjee describes this as the public and in a way, the inner and the outer. The inner was where the women were. the domestic work, and the colonial state, the British colonizers were very deeply aware that they cannot touch these matters because of the kind of reaction that they would get from the larger society. Because women issues are not something that you can mediate upon. These are our concerns. You can't enter into our realm. You can't enter into the inner realm. You can't enter into what was the spiritual realm. And fascinatingly, the spiritual inner private realm became the secluded zones for women. And women did agitate. It was women who were fighting, who were writing, who were engaging, who were talking amongst themselves, who were giving extensive lectures, who were setting up schools on their own, trying to get funds from everywhere. And fascinatingly, when we look at the nationalist movement, or I was looking at some of the books on social reforms in modern India, and all the social reformers, all men, whether it was Agarkar, whether it was Bhandarkar, whether it was Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar or Vivekanand. And if you look at their writings, for example, some of the social reformers that you sort of read and engage with, they have a very problematic understanding of what a woman ought to be. And a lot of that woman ought to be is considered as domestic, as a wife, as a glorified mother. There is no idea of the emancipated, egalitarian milieu. There's no idea of a woman on her own. A woman constantly has to be in these roles. And if a woman is outside these roles of a glorified mother, of a mother and a daughter and a wife, there are huge problems with that. So it's so interesting that, a lot of these women were writing on a variety of these concerns, whether it came to child marriage, whether it came to widow remarriage, whether it came to the whole practice of sati, whereby women were expected to burn themselves on the pyre of their husband if the husband died. And a lot of female infanticide, women education, women political participation. So a lot of these themes and exploration, it will not be possible for me to go through the entire universe, but the universe is extremely rich. And it is just so fascinating to, I've started doing this work for the last 5 years, and I still feel that I'm scratching the surface, because every time I find a new woman, and then I find an entire sort of universe of their works and contributions, and it's just absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing. So coming to our first thinker, Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, 1858 to 1922, some of her key works is Sri Purush Tulna, Letters of Correspondences, The High Caste Hindu Woman, a testimony of her inexhaustible treasure. I'm using High Caste Hindu Woman. So a quick story about Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. She is somebody who's been bestowed with the title of Saraswati. So Saraswati would be is the name of the goddess of knowledge, but it was a title which was out to women of extraordinary, exemplary knowledge, and who have had a certain kind of training and knowledge of the Shastras, of the Hindu scriptures. So she was somebody who her father trained into the Hindu scriptures, and she was one of the first women orators of these scriptures, because at that time women were not allowed to have any kind of access to these scriptures and knowledge. Women were not allowed to have knowledge. And coming from like some ancient text which actually basically argued or basically created this image of women being dumb as an animal, and a woman and an animal, a cow, should be always kept in control. So she is somebody who's teaching these and kind of engaging with these texts and kind of problematizes it. And there's a point that she decides to convert to Christianity. She wanted to study medicine, but she's not allowed to study medicine. And that becomes a big sort of motivation for her to go to England. And she comes to England in 1880s. And that is the time, and through the church, through the connection of the Anglican Church, and she comes to England. She converts, she's baptized. And then she gets into the problem with the Anglican Church and the other sisters who said that, you can't really do a lot of things that you want to do. And which is like a huge sort of moment of setback for her. But interestingly, around the same time in America, one of the Indian women who's also her known, like a distant relative, Anandibai Joshi. She's getting her degree for medicine, for becoming a doctor. And she's invited to that convocation. And that is the time she goes to England, America. And she is so inspired by the way of life and the kind of liberties that women had. And that kind of inspires her to sort of, I mean, she always wanted to set up a school for girl children here in India. But all the funding so she writes this high caste Hindu woman as a pamphlet to educate the American as well as the national audience about why we need to get women educated. And she receives a lot of funds, and her pamphlet is very, very successful. And she converts into her conversion to Christianity also opens a lot of windows for her. But fascinatingly, her engagement with religion becomes very, very fascinating because she is a widow herself. She'd always been a radical woman. I mean, she got married very late when she was 16. 16 was late at that point of time. She marries to somebody, she comes from a high caste, and she marries somebody from a lower caste, which is radical again, because they share a lot of social they share a lot of radical views and opinions about what a life for a woman should be. Probably that was the reason. And then he passes away, he dies, and she raises her daughter, who's just 1 year old by the time her husband dies. So she experiences a lot of challenges, and she also experiences what it is to be a widow. So a lot of their knowledge, in case of Pandita Ramabai, a lot of her knowledge is also coming from her experiences of being a widow. And being a widow was a very, very sad situation in 19th century because it was a very torturous life. So basically, you had to live a life just as a corpse. You're not supposed to be having any desires. You can't wear any color. You have to shave your head. You have to follow all these rituals. And then, she kind of lays the text open and argues about the hypocrisy and the double standards that these texts have, and how these religious scriptures are controlling women, are not allowing women to have any kind of agency in their own lives. And she argues that, when did the situation become bad? The situation started becoming worse when some men decided to write these scriptures, and they were deciding what should happen for a woman. And she's also known as somebody who sets up the first residential schools for the widows, where she not just educates them, but also there's a lot of vocational training so that they can lead a life. They can lead a life in which they are economically independent and they're in a position to do things. And at that point of time, there were a lot of child widows as well. So you need to understand, where her concern is coming from. And there have been a lot of critique of Ramabai also. She had to face a lot of social ostracism because of her work. Begum Rokeya Shekhawat Hussain, Sultana's Dream, she sets up large number of schools and universities. But what's radical about her? There's one particular poem that I would want to share with you, which is Sultana's Dream, which is basically when there's a conversation between two women, Sultana and Sara. Sultana comes from this world, the world of Rokeya, whereby women are not allowed to get educated, women are not allowed any kind of access or opportunities. And she dreams of this. So she goes, it's basically a dream, therefore it's Sultana's Dream, in which she meets Sara. And Sara's world is a very different world. It is referred to as the Ladyland. It is a wonderful world, and it is many a times referred to as a feminist utopia, in which and also she's a Muslim woman, and so her subjectivity also brings a lot of her writings also brings a lot of insight about the condition of Muslim women. And one particular practice which was very, very common amongst them was women behind the veil, behind the parda, and they had to be secluded from any kind of, that was referred as zanana, where male entry was not allowed. It was a women's space, but it was like a jail. It was like a very, very secluded space. But in the Ladyland, it is the men who are kept as part of the zananas, and they're called as mardana. And the kind of arguments that women have been sort of put put up like the kind of arguments that would seclude women or deny women these opportunities. There is such inversion. And this is this is a lady land where there is women university, where they're doing such scientifically advanced things, which is basically freed women from the drudgery of the house and the domesticity. And women are playing, this is 1905. I mean, pretty radical for that point of time, where there were no universities, no schools. But in this imagination, she's trying to basically explain all of that she feels would be perfect for an egalitarian or for an emancipated women life. And she sets up school. Her husband was a huge supporter, and that was the reason who also kind of educated her. And she sets up school and eventually university. So she was in a way a flag bearer of women's education in early 20th century. Interestingly, in 1905, India is going through a huge movement against colonialism. It's called the Swadeshi and boycott movement, which was to boycott the British British education. There's a lot of emphasis on national education. And Rokeya's text comes at such a good time, because when she's talking about the Ladyland, in which she's talking about women being scientists and doctors and doing all these amazing things, but interestingly, at that point of time also, you find a lot of national education, you find a lot of schools, but I'm not sure how many women's schools were actually being set up. But in a way, she does that. And also, she's a huge activist for the reform of the condition for Muslim women life, and she sets up the Islamic Women's Association. So these women were setting up institutions, they were setting up collectives whereby there was this larger sort of discourse. Tarabai Shinde, 1815 to 1910, and it's very difficult to find an image of her. So this is just a recreation. And very, very fascinatingly, she writes this book in 1882, which is a Stri Purush Tulna, a comparison between men and women, and to know who's more wicked and immoral. And it's a satirical text. It is a text which is so radical, and it kind of has arguments for everything that have been used against women, about irrationality of women, about morality, about virtues. And she says that, listen, basically you are all have double standards. Men have double standards. All the things that they deny women from doing, they end up doing the same thing. How is it that you call women immoral for committing an act of having relationship with another man, because there's a man she's in a relationship with? And all these virtues that you've created, all these controls that you have created, all these ideas that you've created, you don't follow any of those ideas. I mean, through religion, through scriptures, you've not allowed women to remarry, and you expect a widow to die and burn on a pyre. But why is it that the religion doesn't have to say anything about man? A man can remarry if his wife is dead. But when it is a woman, why is she expected to become a widow? Why is she expected to to die on a pyre? So all these double standards, all these ideas about it's basically coding. It's basically this whole construction of what an ideal woman is. And this is so problematic. Because in order for you to get married to an ideal woman, you have to be an ideal, but unfortunately, you're not ideal in your own activities. You're drinking, your vices, you're gambling. You're the first to adopt the British way of life. You're the first to dress up like a Britisher. You are doing everything. So according to the Hindu religious scriptures, women, I mean, as a pious Hindu, you were not supposed to be crossing the river, the sea. You're not supposed to be traveling outside. And she says that you go, you do all your travels, you come back and you ambulate yourself, and you put cow urine and you put all of that on yourself. And now you're a religious person, you're a holy person. But if a woman would do that, you will take her and you would kill her, you will brand her as a witch. So it's just so fascinating. And she asks the women not to fall into this trap. So there's a very radical, subversive idea of what the self should be. And she also takes all these mythologies and texts into consideration and argues that, all these myths, all these religious scriptures which have been handed down to us are so problematic. It is problematic because it is constantly controlling you. It is constantly asking you to be of a certain type. And who knows who's written these scriptures? Where are these myths coming from? So don't fall, use your rationality. And therefore, the idea of getting educated, of getting outside the mold. Quickly, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, absolutely fascinating, 1903 to 1988. She's somebody who's witnessed India's journey. She participated in the national movement. She participated post-independence, did significant amount of work with regard to the revitalization of arts and craft, handicraft, and she is a fiery socialist feminist. But she always mentions that I don't want to be referred to as a feminist, but I have a gendered understanding about the larger things. And she's somebody who sets up, she's one of the founding members of Congress Socialist Party, which was like the nascent organization of socialism in India. And interestingly, when we talk about socialism, we have Jayaprakash Narayan, we have Ram Manohar Lohia, and all these great male, but Kamla doesn't really figure out much. And she was somebody who worked extensively. And she draws this very interesting relationship between capitalism, imperialism, and subjection of women. And she says that this whole imperial capitalist sort of thing, which encourages people to go for more and more wars, would expect women to stay at home and produce children, because then these children can go for wars. And very interesting, she kind of challenges this whole idea of the glorified motherhood, and she basically argues how problematic it is. And it is women who should decide and should have autonomy over her body and her choice. And this is radical. This is happening in 1930s. And of course, she's successful. She goes to America. She does all these lectures and she's learning all these safe practices. And then she comes back to India in 1951. She sets up the first Family Planning Commission of India. One thing that we should understand, that a lot of people celebrate India, that look at India, it's given all these rights to women and to say no, and they can actually abort. They have a right for abortion. But one needs to understand that the abortion idea is not coming from the idea of the emancipation of the woman or giving her rights. It's for population control. But her argument for family planning was a different one. It was a women choosing, women's choice, women's autonomy. And at that point of time, she managed to convince the state in a certain way. Of course, the population logic would have happened. But if you look at her writings, you get a different sense. The sexual division of labor, constantly talking about different wages, different jobs, and how women were lesser paid in both industrial and agrarian setup, talking about the rights of the women worker. And the last thing about, democratic socialism, of course, a certain way of life, but it needs to be gendered. So I would just conclude by saying that, Indian women thinking have been very rich, very diverse, and we are all starting to work. We are starting to think 1970s onwards. There's been a huge shift, a lot of attention, but important to invoke them as thinkers and not just as women activists, because they had ideas, and these ideas were powerful in transformation. Some of the things that I've been doing, we need to teach more. We need to bring more courses. We need to infiltrate collectives, platforms. We should not have just our own platforms, but we need to go out there and say that, you need to take these voices seriously. And this can only happen if the regular courses that we teach, we infiltrate them, we make them gendered, we bring women thinkers. That's something that I've been doing for the last 5 years, that whatever research I do, I make it a point to have a gendered perspective to that, and encouraging more research, creating more archives, encouraging people from across the world to find women from their own sort of, it could be a grandmother, it could be an aunt, it could be anyone, but somebody who has a certain kind of position on social condition, and have more images on the wall, because we need to encourage the future generation. I want to encourage my niece. I want to encourage the young girl and tell them that, you can't from that ancestry, you come from that heritage. It was not all the uncles and grandfathers and fathers who created this world, but these grandmothers, these aunties, these mothers who had so many sacrifices. Because women have played a very important role in shaping history. It is time that we engage with them as philosophers, as scientists, as thinkers, and do more of what I call as gendered global intellectual history of ideas. Thank you very much.